just so that we can circulate it out and post it on the website post meeting for those that may not have been able to attend or were not able to get onto the session. Jackie Cool is running our PowerPoint for us today, so thank you, Jackie, and perhaps we can just flip over to the next slide here. Similar to previous town halls and large meetings that we've run on the platform, we're going to be following a similar format. Apparently, I did not quite get the moderating nailed last time I did it, so Kevin has me moderating the call again in the meeting this time as well too. Just a reminder to keep your webcams turned off and keep yourselves muted if you can throughout the call, just to lessen the noise in the background. I'll go through the agenda briefly, but what I am going to ask is that we pause to ask all questions at the end of the presentations, because I think much of your questions may be answered through the presentation format that we have. I would ask again that you send questions in by text, so you can send them directly to me at 403-804-2708, and just simply state your name, your club, and the question that you have. If we're not able to get through all the questions today, and I believe we should be able to, but if we're not able to, we will track questions and make sure that we get them out to everybody as soon as we can following the presentation. As well, following the meeting today, if you still have some additional questions, please feel free to send them in to either myself or Kevin or any of the Swim Alberta staff, and we'll make sure they get directed and answered, and follow-up happen as quickly as we're able to. What we're looking at doing today from an agenda perspective is we've already gone through the meeting logistics and sort of process for the call. I'm going to do a brief welcome and introduction and talk a little bit about stage 2 announcements and implications. Then Kevin will walk through the changes that we've made to our in-person training and swimming requirements document that has been updated and was circulated to the membership yesterday, I believe it was. And then Stephen Patrick's joined us, and he'll be able to walk through some of the guidance documents that were published last week as it relates to return to sport. And he'll highlight some key areas that will be relevant for us from a swimming perspective. And then following that, Kevin's going to work through just a few swimming cohort examples, because you'll see much has changed since we met 2 weeks ago. And then we'll open it up to questions and answers if that works with the group. I did just want to talk a little bit about the announcement that was made last week and the changes that came into effect as of last Friday. And before I sort of dive into that, I just want to stress, and I know that this is similar to what our clubs have all been doing as well, but the safety of our athletes and membership will always remain a priority as we go forward and as we look at relaunching activities both within our club settings and from a Swim Alberta perspective. You would have heard the announcement last week that had facilities, including pools, moved into stage 2. As of June 12th, stage 2 launched. And so we will see over the course probably of the next several weeks, a number of our facilities across the province begin to open. We have continued to work closely with our facility and our pool operators throughout the entire pandemic, actually starting back in March, with regular meetings and connections with them, and we will continue to work with them. Like I said, we have a number of them on the call with us today, and we've also been doing sessions with the aquatic professional group across the province, and this Thursday we have sessions that we're doing with Life Saving Society and a reach out to pool operators across the province as well too, so that we can share our return to swimming and in-person training plan with them, so they also have a bit of a knowledge about the requirements that we have in place in alignment with our clubs when you reach out to meet with our facility partners as well too. So that work is ongoing, and we'll continue to work closely, obviously, with our clubs and facility providers across the province. I did just want to talk briefly about the information session that we had on June 2nd. We had recorded that session, and our intent was to get it out to the group, as well as with the Q&A that we had summarized. And to be quite honest with you,
that's an Alberta call. I joined on my.
That was being finalized on Tuesday, the day that the announcement came out. So just prior to us being able to push all that information out to our clubs, the press conference with the government happened on 12:30 last Tuesday. And at that point, it made most of what we had worked on and some of the questions that were asked as it aligned to the Swimming Canada resource document not as relevant. And so we will combine some of the questions from that session that are more relevant as we go forward with anything that comes out of today's session. I did just want to acknowledge the Swimming Canada Return to Swimming resource document and the presentation that we had a couple of weeks ago with John Atkinson and Alan Wrigley. The resource document produced by Swimming Canada was always intended to be a guideline document, with the understanding that each province would need to follow the lead of their local health authority. So that document was actually created and developed, I would say, when we were looking very much at mass gatherings of 15, when we weren't sure when pools were going to open. And although it has some great pieces in there as it relates to physical distancing and what clubs can do to pull together working groups to establish their return to sport and return to play, we recognize that some of the phased approach they had with the steps to returning into the water likely doesn't align with what we're allowed to do at this point from an Alberta perspective. So I just want to acknowledge that that is a guideline document. There is some great information in there that we can still utilize. But as we go forward, we will continue to align with Alberta Health Services in the direction that we receive through our own local health authority. The other piece I just wanted to mention briefly is that similar to recognizing that facilities will slowly come on board over the next several weeks, and some may choose not to come on board into the fall months, we recognize that our clubs too will all be in a very different situation, and you all must take sort of a pause and look at your own risk management process and your next steps as you look at how you want to launch into stage 2 and when you will do it. We also recognize that not everybody will return back to the pool. Some will pause through the summer. There may be some clubs that as pools open will be looking to work with facility operators to get in, and some will pause later into the fall. So I stress with the information and the change to what we're allowed to do, clubs will need to work really closely with their facility operators and make sure that they have some really solid return to swimming guidelines and processes in play as well too. The final thing I just wanted to mention is just a reminder that before you return to in-person training and before you return to swimming in the pool, that we do require the club declaration forms signed by the head coach and the president of the club. And we also require assumption and acknowledgement of risk forms from all athletes and all coaches. So once you get your club declarations form signed and into us, Val will be able to set up for you the electronic version of the risk forms that can go out and can be circulated to your membership so that they can be electronically signed, and they automatically then come back into Swimming Canada and Swim Alberta. So just a reminder as you're beginning to relaunch your activities that those are 2 requirements that we do need in place before you can begin to start. And the other piece I just wanted to mention briefly, and sorry I got my slides mixed up. I wanted to talk about this a little bit first, but as we launch into stage 2, you're going to notice that we have the ability to likely pull swimming cohorts together to train in ways that we probably didn't imagine was possible 2 weeks ago when we held this meeting with our clubs at that point. But I also want to stress that we're still in the midst of a pandemic as we look at how we return to in-person training and swimming. And we have had some shared principles all along that as a swimming community we followed. And I know you're all very aware of these, but I still just want to stress that we do want to follow the guidelines of Alberta Health Services as it relates to physical distancing, recognizing there are going to be some unique things that we can do within our training cohorts. Continue the hygiene that we've all been stressing within our families and within our club setting as it relates to coughing and sneeze etiquette, hand washing, masks, that type of thing. And the screening and self-assessment tools will be vital to your club as you go forward and relaunch back into the in-person training and swimming. So again, I know these are all shared principles that you know, but I think as we begin to move into phase 2 and we have the opportunity to do some training activities that we didn't quite imagine was possible a couple of weeks ago, it's important that as clubs we continue to communicate, and as coaches and board members really demonstrate through our leadership the shared principles as well too. So with that, I am going to pause and I am going to turn it over to Kevin Dennis, who is going to walk through the updates from the Swim Alberta requirement document. Kevin, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Cheryl. Okay, as Cheryl mentioned, this is our latest update with our Swim Alberta requirements. These updates are, I'm just going to highlight the major changes. As at our last meeting a couple of weeks ago, I went much more sort of in depth through the entire document. So the format of the document is, the format of the document is, if you've read it, is basically unchanged, but the actual content with some specific items based on last week's update, there's some obvious changes. So I'll just give these are just sort of the quick bullet point updates. So the first, obviously, in the overview is that we have moved on to stage 3, which is the return to swimming. And so that also includes the return to outdoor training portion included in that. On pages 8 and 9 of the document, there's some updates to the requirements of Alberta Health Services. So the updated oversight by a responsible person, formally that responsible person was designated as 18 years old. And so that age specific requirement is no longer in those documents. We've added the cohort information, and there will be more information on that shortly. Updated the gathering size, and so the maximum gathering size, for both indoor and outdoor activities has been updated in the document. So that would be a maximum gathering of 100 for outdoors, as well as whatever there's facility requirements, or obviously the cohort has an opportunity for a group of up to 50, but like I said, we'll go back to the cohorts in a minute. There's updated guidance links for both return to sport, physical activity and recreation, as well as pools and whirlpools guidance documents. So an additional update is the contact tracing. That contact tracing requirement is 2 weeks. That being said, most clubs have the standard process and should have the standard process of attendance records as the normal day-to-day process for the clubs and for the coaches to ensure they know who's at practice, and for multiple other coaching reasons with respect to that. With respect to the Swim Alberta requirements, the requirement
muted. Unmuted.
Sorry, my computer just muted there for a second. I'm not too sure why. With respect to the Swim Alberta requirements, the requirement of a signed acknowledgement and assumption of risk form, as well as the addition of a designated COVID representative, are two of the major updates. And so that addition of a designated COVID representative is an individual that is going to be up to speed on, whatever the latest updates are from Alberta Health Services or within their local municipality. If there's a case within a cohort or within a training group, making sure that the appropriate steps are taken. And so there is information as to the roles and responsibilities of that COVID representative in terms of one of the appendixes. And so that is more of a major update to the document. Return to swimming requirements for specific requirements. There's a little bit of an update with respect to the wording of the priority groups in the phased return information, as well as updated dryland information. Previously, the document stated no dryland on the pool deck. That being said, there's facilities that do have designated spaces. And so having dryland in a clearly marked designated space that's appropriate for dryland within a facility, should it be on deck, that would be something where we would encourage the clubs to work with the facility to come up with the appropriate return to swimming plan as it pertains to each facility. And then sort of the final major set of updates are the appendices. And so pages 20 to 30, there is an updated contact tracing log, just it changes the 2 weeks versus the 6. All the checklists have had minor revisions for the swimmer, coaches, and parent. The club checklist has had, I'd say, significant updates and changes based on the announcement this last week and all the way through with respect to our Swim Alberta requirements, the health services requirements, and the return to swimming requirements. And then the COVID representative and the swimming cohort examples are also appendixes that have been updated. All of those appendixes are available on the COVID page, where the latest version of this document or the most recent version of this document will always be kept. So that's sort of the review of the requirements. And like Cheryl mentioned, I will provide a couple or just talk about the cohort examples in a little bit. So I think it's over to Stephen.
So I'll just do a quick intro to Stephen.
Sorry, Cheryl.
Thank you. No, that's okay. I just wanted to thank Stephen for joining us today. Again, as mentioned, he works with the provincial government within the Sport, Physical Activity and Recreation branch as a sport consultant. So we've had the opportunity in the past to work with Stephen mostly around games and multi-sport games, but with him working on the return to play strategies, felt it would be good to have him come and share some insights and highlights around the two resource documents produced by Alberta Health Services as it relates to return to sport, and probably not so much the swimming pools, but more the return to sport. So welcome, Stephen, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Cheryl and Kevin. I'd also like to introduce Julie Hurd. Julie is a sport consultant within the sport development unit within Sport, Physical Activity and Recreation, and Julie works with Swim Alberta as their main consultant with government in non-COVID times. So guidance documents have been created by Alberta Health. I'm sure you're all familiar with them. If you aren't, you can go to the Biz Connect website. That's BIZ Connect. Just Google that, or the link is on the screen here. Probably a little bit of an oversight on my part, just in terms of producing these slides and generically. Obviously, there's the guidance for swimming pools and whirlpools as well, which is extremely relevant for this group. But just to take you through these a little bit, first and foremost, it's important to note that Alberta Health Services are the ones that set all policy, and pretty much everything runs through Dr. Dina Hinshaw's desk. And our role within Sport, Physical Activity and Recreation has been to work with her team over at AHS to look at things through a sport lens. So we first, in stage one, May 29th, we had the guidance for organized outdoor sport, physical activity and recreation. Those guidance documents, or that guidance documents, will soon be removed. They are seen as being a bit obsolete at this point. And the new guidance that was released last Tuesday, the guidance for sport, physical activity, and recreation in stage 2. So those are the ones that I'm primarily going to be referencing. The guidance for swimming pools and whirlpools also do a good job, especially I think they do a better job around the cohort piece. So we'll talk about that as we go here. So next slide, please. So just some considerations for return to sport, physical activity, and recreation. And none of this is new. I mean, Cheryl talked about the shared principles earlier of physical distancing, hygiene, and screening and tracking. And, as she mentioned, we're still full on in this pandemic. What we're trying to do with stage 2, what the provincial government is trying to do is a bit of a compromise. So yes, let's return to sport. There are obviously benefits that sport provide that we want to. And so a lot of what's in the guidance document is about mitigating the risk. We understand that there will be transmission. We're opening up our bubbles. We're opening up our interactions with people. So how do we go about sport in a safe manner? And so obviously the daily screening that you guys have heard about before. So before every activity, and I know there's some good resources within the return to in-person training and swimming that Swim Alberta has created. We want to ensure that if someone is there at a session, they are as healthy as we can determine. So, we'll be asking those questions daily, and then participant tracking for 2 weeks worth of records. So if there is an outbreak, we'll be able to do a little bit of tracing and find out, who else may have been exposed. Obviously, no shared personal items, and again, these aren't new. And I apologize if I'm kind of going over some basics here, but towels, water bottles, shared snacks, anything that we previously shared before, obviously a no now. So refrain from that. The hand sanitation, we want to refrain from touching our face while participating as much as possible. And I know, obviously, in the pool, it's a little tough to use some hand sanitizer. It doesn't probably have the same effect as if we were outdoors. And then obviously up to 100 people outdoors with physical distancing is allowed. Again, what we want to stress here is that even in the cohort situation that I'll get into in a minute, we want to be physically distancing as much as possible. So once we've cohorted, we still, if we're outdoors training, if we're on the pool deck, if we're in the locker rooms, if we're in lobbies, if we're out in the parking lots, we want to be stressing that we still need to be physical distancing, and this will just reduce the transmission. Okay, so one of the biggest changes with the stage 2 guidance documents is the introduction of cohorts. What this means is that groups of up to 50 people may train and play together within a cohort. Once they're established in a cohort, they do not necessarily need to physical distance. And I know Kevin's got some great examples coming up with regards to how this applies to the swim community. The cohort will include all personnel. Sorry, I've got players in there. Again, this is a generic document. Your athletes, your coaches, any officials that are not able to physically distance. You may have coaches coach multiple cohorts if they are physically distancing. And athletes are asked to participate in only one cohort at a time. So, you may have some multi-sport athletes out there. All we can do is communicate this requirement. We don't expect the clubs to be policing this, to be asking in their daily screenings if they're members of other cohorts or anything like that. But what this does, again, is it kind of mitigates the risk. So we know that each athlete is in an individual cohort. Their siblings might be participating in a different cohort within swimming or perhaps in a different sport. Mom and dad might be in cohorts. And as well, in addition to these individual sport cohorts, there are the family cohorts that are allowed too, which is up to 15 people in a family cohort. So, if you've got a 5-person family, we're up to now 250 people. We're up to potentially, adding another, 10 people on top of that with a family cohort of 15. So the amounts are increasing pretty much, exponentially. And so it's all about risk, and it's all about, understanding that this is a compromise, and we need to keep people as contained as much as possible, and yet still allow them to go about their daily lives and participate in sport and other activities. Coaches, you may be a soccer player, and you may be in a soccer cohort, in which case you wouldn't be able to be in a swim cohort as well. So again, you'd have to keep that physical distancing in place as you're coaching your swim athletes. Right now, the cohort duration is through the end of stage 2. We are getting some clarification on what the 2-week quarantine would look like if, for example, you wanted to mix up cohorts, or someone is moving from their summer swim program into a fall hockey program. And so once we get some clarification on that, we'll definitely be in touch. But with the fact that these durations go through the end of stage 2, and with not having any clue as to when stage 2 will end, we really ask that you put a lot of thought into creating cohorts, and not just the first 50 people that sign up, but look at your end goal for a couple of months down the road. And where do you want to be with training, and who might be in those cohorts? So again, just put some thought into this and how you create these, because once those athletes are in, if they have to come out or you're adding new people in, then you have to look at the quarantine process, which is obviously not ideal for 2 weeks. And again, I mentioned it earlier, members of cohort should physically distance wherever possible when not swimming, pool decks, lobbies, etc. Certainly, I'll be around after the presentation for any questions that come through, but I think that's it for now. High-level approach.
Great. Thanks, Stephen, for sharing that and walking through that with us.
I don't hear Cheryl anymore, so I don't know if I'm not too sure if she's just dropped off. So I'm going to go ahead and just quickly talk about some of these cohort examples. And so just with respect to what we tried to do with respect to the cohorts, they're new. And so these are by no means the only opportunities or examples that clubs have. And before putting a cohort into a facility, making sure that plan is communicated with the facility, and what other types of requirements there are would be the idea. So example A, there might be 2 different training groups within a club, and each training group is 12 swimmers with a coach. And so training group 1 in 3 lanes, so that's 4 swimmers a lane. Training group 2, 3 lanes with 12 swimmers, so that's also 4 swimmers a lane. They would essentially be one cohort of 24 swimmers, because groups 1 and 2 are training side by side. Example B here, with very similar groupings, but with an empty lane in between, would essentially form 2 separate cohorts. And so those are 2 examples. We can go on to the next slide, Jackie. Thank you. So the example C is example C and D are basically examples where there's a blend of a cohort and some individual swimmers, which may be needed depending on circumstance within each club. And so example C has single swimmers in lanes 1 to 4, and so 4 swimmers with 1 per lane, and then lanes 5 through 8 is 16 swimmers. Maybe that was supposed to be, so that's 4 swimmers a lane. So basically that would be a cohort of 17 swimmers, because that swimmer in lane 4 is arguably less than 2 meters away for the duration of training than the swimmers in lanes 5 through 8. But they're still swimming on the center line, and so therefore swimmers in lane 1 to 3 are still in individual scenarios. Example D is 15 swimmers with for individual swimmers. And so there's 5 lanes with 3 swimmers a lane. And then there's 2 lanes that, would be swimming as a double lane. So they'd be going down one black line, back up the other black line, potentially starting at each end. So everybody has their own designated T mark, and they're basically swimming a big double lane with those 4 swimmers. And those 4 swimmers are individual, and they're able to maintain their distancing. So those would be my 4 primary cohort examples. As to a club's breakdown and rationale, part of the thought is if there is a case that occurs within a club, does the overall club need to, if the whole club is one cohort, for example, of 50 swimmers, are all 50 swimmers then out of the water? And if they are one cohort, that potentially would be a result. So the clubs do, as Stephen mentioned, the clubs do need to give some significant thought and some, have an appropriate process and model and work with their facility to come up with their cohort models. So at this point, that's sort of the rough examples. I do have a little bit more explanation under the examples in the document, so feel free to take a look at that afterwards. So I'll turn it back over to Cheryl.
Great, thanks, Kevin. And I apologize to the group and to Stephen. My system shut down in the midst of that follow up from Stephen. So we have a couple of questions that have come in, and thanks, Kevin and Stephen, for walking through that, because that was a great overview to the cohorts process, and also to just speaking about the thought that needs to go into it. I did get a question from Dave McDonald, just related to the accessibility of the assumption of risk forms. Dave, I don't know if you want to unmute. I'm assuming because they're being sent directly into Swim Alberta and Swimming Canada, your question is around knowing from a club perspective if they've been signed. Is that correct? I'm going to assume that is the question. So, oh, he's a phone caller. Okay, so I'm going to assume that is his question. So we will look into that if the club is not able to see the list of forms that have come in. Val, do you have any update on that? Because I know you were testing the forms with Swimming Canada.
Right now, what we're requesting, the parent gets a copy of the form. So we're requesting that they forward it onto the club at the moment.
Okay. So, and we'll also track the lists as well too. So we'll try to work out a system that works well with the clubs to make sure that they're aware of those athletes that have signed the assumption of risk forms as well too. So we'll take that back, Dave, as well. The other question that I had come in from Jason Pratt with Cascade was just with regard to the screening questions and whether they could be put on a form similar to the acknowledgement of risk form. I don't know how easy that would be able to do because that form needs to be filled out quickly. It was an Adobe product that Swimming Canada purchased, and they had to actually be able to modify it to have it send the forms directly to the respective provinces as well as to Swimming Canada. I don't believe it's the intent that those screening checklist forms are collected on a daily basis, and maybe Stephen can speak a little bit to that from the government's perspective. But the important piece just is that the athletes are actually, and the coaches are going through that screening questionnaire, but I don't believe they need to be submitted. Stephen, do you want to talk about that, please?
Yeah, I don't believe it's mandatory. I mean, the big thing is the participant tracking or tracing, but you may wish to. What this will do is help on the liability side of things as well. So if someone does come down with COVID and there's a challenge, you can show as a club or an association that you have been screening it, and you have, listen, here, everybody has said yes, yes, yes to all these questions, or I guess, sorry, no, no, no to all these questions. So you may want to tuck those away for a couple of weeks and keep them just from a liability perspective.
Okay. So we'll look into that, Jason, and see if there's something that we can maybe set up other than the fillable PDF, but that would be available for clubs to use and collect as well too. We have a question from Mike Blondell with the University of Calgary Swim Club, and I'm going to turn this one over to Stephen as well too. I think if new swimmers join into a cohort, what happens? Swimmers will come and go somewhat throughout the summer.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, if you're not yet at 50, if your cohort is, you know, it's under 50 and you're just adding athletes, I think that's fine. You know, once they drop off, they should in essence be spending 14 days away from, you know, whatever they do next. But again, that's not something you can really police. I think if they're coming in from a different swimming cohort, you need to be cognizant of that. So if they're, you know, if they're moving to Calgary from a different location for, you know, going to university or whatever, what have you, you know, you need to be cognizant of kind of what their activities were prior. Again, we're still trying to get some clarification on what it means, the 14-day quarantine, if it's an actual full quarantine or not. And I've just had a document come across my desk with regards to another issue. And it sounds like it's just 14 days away from sport. So it isn't a full quarantine. It's it sounds like you just can't join another cohort for 14 days. So again, I'm going to try and get some clarification on that. It's really difficult right now for us to get anything out of health. They're super taxed, and although we have some, you know, we have contacts and inroads there, it does take some time. So it's on our list, and once we have some more information on that quarantine piece, I will be in touch.
Okay, that's great. And just a follow up, he just added that he assumes that we're not considering September at this time. So I think it's too. We don't know because we don't know when stage 3 will hit us, right? But
yeah, that's a fair comment. I mean, as a parent with some kids in, you know, some fairly large high schools, if they end up going back to school in September full on, it's going to be pretty difficult to justify the 50-person cohort when they're walking the halls with people, you know, 1,400 other kids that they could be participating in another sport with. So, you know, things change very quickly in the health world. We've been told by them that, you know, what they tell us in the morning could be different at night. So stage 3 is a long way away right now, and we can't really predict. So I would take kind of the next few months as the rules that we're under right now, and worry about things down the road later.
Okay. And this is a question similar, and I think you might have answered it, but can we have a summer cohort and then stop for 14 days and begin our winter cohort?
Yeah, that would definitely be the you know, the understanding with the cohorts is that, you know, once they're out of that 14 days, they can move on to something different, and you know, it's for sure inside your clubs as well.
Right. The other question that we received, and this might be a combination Kevin and Stephen question, and maybe even Cheryl, can you have 48 swimmers in the pool plus 2 coaches in a cohort to make 50 with 6 to 8 per lane?
From a pure numbers point, that works on our end. It's 50 total. Kevin, you can maybe speak to the specific swim lane piece.
You know, with respect to following our provincial guidelines, that would be something that is permitted. That being said, this is something where the clubs are going to have to work with their facility, and they're also going to have to determine whether or not it's in their best interest. There's nothing saying that you can't. The questions are, you know, what should you do? Who are the other parties involved? I think those are the other questions that need to be asked. So there's nothing to say you can't do that. It's whether you should do that, I think, would be fair. But.
Yeah, I think you have to look at that from a club perspective, right? And that's back to that opening comment about risk management. And the more you put in a cohort, the greater chance that if someone gets sick in that cohort, the entire cohort is not swimming. And so I'm assuming, and as clubs, you know your structure best. But I'm assuming probably your training groups that you normally use are likely sort of the cohort size that you'd probably be looking at doing. A follow-up question to that, again, is in a similar vein, is how many people can swim in 8 lanes in one cohort? And is there a maximum number of swimmers to a 25-meter lane? And again, I'll throw that one to Kevin, but I think we've kind of answered it in the previous question. That's from Mike Meldrum.
Yeah, I think it's a similar type of answer. It's up to that maximum of 50 in a cohort. You could arguably have 50 swimmers only in a cohort if the coach is able to maintain their distancing the entire time. And so, you know, those are decisions and questions for the club for you to work with their facility. And there may be regional or, you know, local requirements in addition to that may or may not come up at various times as well.
That's right, yeah. So, and I
Cheryl,
think these are examples too. Go ahead, Stephen, go ahead.
Sorry, I'll just jump in there. Just again, one thing to consider is that you know, once you form your cohorts, we want mixing and mingling to be at a minimum in terms of, you know, when those athletes are coming into the pool with other cohorts and things like that. So, you know, Kevin's cohort examples had some, you know, some swimmers that were outside of the cohort participating in lanes that are, you know, an appropriate distance away. But you just need to think through, and the facility operators need to think through the traffic flow patterns and keeping those athletes separate on the pool decks and things like that as well. Just traffic in and out of the change rooms and all of that. So, yeah.
I would agree. And I would say, again, a reminder that we're still in the midst of a pandemic. So even though, again, we have these cohorts that we didn't imagine a couple of weeks ago, I think clubs need to think quite carefully about just assuming it's back to what swimming was prior to March 15th. Another question we have come in from Lucianne relates to if you have people in the same cohort and they're doing dry land, can they do exercises in pairs, such as throwing a medicine ball back and forth?
Yeah, for sure. So within the cohort itself, I mean, if you think to some other sports, some contact sports, football is going to be allowed to play within cohorts. So, you know, there's full-on body contact and things like that. The shared apparatus in terms of medicine balls or anything else you'd be using, it's not an issue. We want to reduce it as much as possible, but you can do it. And just think about, you know, how you disinfect at the end of the dry land session, and you know, maybe if there's a medicine ball being passed around, you know, if you don't have enough for every pair and they're doing kind of different stations. So before the next group of 2 moves over, you know, think about possibilities of disinfecting that equipment and how you do it. But yes, you know, I mean, they can pair up, do those types of activities. They, in essence, 50 people can in essence be in a huddle. Is it ideal? No. So, you know, plan your activities so that you keep them apart as much as possible, but understand that within the cohort, they are allowed to be next to each other in those situations that can't be avoided.
Yeah. The other question we had, and it's kind of related to the document, but we use the same language that Alberta Health Services use. So in our document, we spoke about staying within regions, so not traveling outside the regions, training in your region. And that was pulled precisely from Alberta Health Services. So Stephen, do you want to maybe speak to what regions mean from an Alberta Health Services perspective, and then I'll get Kevin to answer it from our document and club perspective.
Sure. So the issues with the guidance documents when you're talking about an infinity number of sports is that sometimes they're way too general and sometimes they're way too specific. We have asked for a little bit of clarification because there are a lot of provincial sport organizations that have questions, and a lot of their members have questions on the region piece, and we haven't yet received it. From my way of thinking, you want to reduce travel as much as possible. So, you know, I'm not sure where we're at with competitions for swimming. I understand that that's not going to be a thing moving forward in the foreseeable future. But are athletes from Sherwood Park allowed to travel into Edmonton to join their club? And the answer is yes. I mean, there's no restrictions on traveling throughout the province. If your family wants to go down to Banff, that's allowed. What we want to do is we want to encourage that people stay as close to home as possible to reduce transmission. So regions are a little bit tough. Obviously the rural region, you're drawing from a larger area for your member clubs than you might in the city, or that may be not accurate as well. You may be drawing from outside the city because of the level of coaching or program you provide. So athletes from a neighboring community are allowed to participate in your club, but we want to minimize that travel as much as possible.
Kevin, anything to add?
I think Stephen summed up the document quite nicely. Thank you, Stephen.
I think you did. Yeah, and I would say that's kind of what we were after as well too, from a regional perspective, basically staying local and minimizing travel at this point. We have a question from Alex Dieppe. Can the same cohort of swimmers train in multiple pools?
Yeah, I think so. Hi, Alex, by the way. Yeah, it's no different than gyms and ice arenas and things like that, where I can imagine cohorts are going to be moving around. Ideally, the facility operators are going to be doing a pretty good cleanse at the end of each day or between cohorts in terms of locker rooms and pool decks and other touch points. So I think that if that's your normal course of training, we don't want to complicate things, but we do want to mitigate risk. So if you don't have to train in other locations, and maybe look at that as an option. But if it's something that you would normally do because of your normal course and it's complicated otherwise, then I think it's allowed.
I think we would concur with that too, Stephen. So the other question I have come in from Brad Morey: can cohorts carpool? So this was actually a good one, Brad, because we actually sought clarification from Stephen on this when we were writing our document.
Yeah, I mean, great question. So yeah, again, cohorts are people that are being linked together and hanging out together in sport. They're breathing on each other. They're running into each other in some other sports and things like that. So the cohorting in carpools is certainly within the realm of that. Again, if you can split other family members, put somebody in the back seat and somebody in the front seat, and to separate them, again, reduce the risk as much as possible, but it's certainly allowed within the cohort.
Great. Just a reminder, if you have questions, you can send them in by text, 403-804-2708. I have another one that just came in here from Kayla at the Repsol Sports Center. In Swimming Canada's document, it outlines whiteboards cannot be used by swim clubs. Will Swim Alberta be recommending this as well? I don't know if we addressed that one, Kevin. I think that changes a little bit with the cohort being permitted here in Alberta.
I think part of that as well is if the coach is included in the cohort or not, and if they are, then they're not able to coach two cohorts. So that's going to be something that I think is very specifically a club decision. If workouts are able to be managed, or if they're able to be managed without the athletes crowding around, maintaining distancing, that's a better scenario. So I think that we didn't address it and have a specific piece in it. I think it's appropriate what's in the Swimming Canada guidance document generally, but if the coach is in the cohort, then maybe you're allowed it, or maybe you permit it as a club, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that would make sense to me as well too. I think the intent was that they didn't gather around it, and it was actually the clean after the use too. If you remember, Alan Wrigley spoke about the brushes and the markers and the board, like because of the high touch. So why don't we take that one away and see if we can get some more clarity on that, Kayla, and then we can sort of circulate an update back out to our clubs as well too, because that was one that we hadn't really looked at with the changes to our document. So we'll flag that one and we'll get back to clubs and our facilities on that.
Just a note here, something I haven't mentioned yet, and obviously safety is always paramount. So, if coaches need to dive into a pool to save somebody, or there's first aid that needs to be required, then you need to you need to do that. If it's a pool deck first aid and the coach is outside of the cohort, we just ask that you mask up. And if you're not in the cohort, and then first aid can be applied with personal protective equipment in place. I don't know generally with regards to lifeguards and things like that. They would have their own set of rules. I would imagine. From the Life Saving Society, etc. But if you're in training or dryland training and someone takes a medicine ball in the wrong spot and you need to administer some first aid, if you're outside of the cohort as a coach, we just ask that you mask up and then you're okay. But safety is obviously paramount.
Yeah, and I would say, Stephen, normally in our pool settings, because lifeguards are always there and we don't train without facility lifeguards, it would be the lifeguards that are dealing with any emergency that happened on the pool deck, even with one of our club members. But that would be a great example for dryland training where we may not have facility people that can assist. And so coaches do need to make sure that they have the first aid and the personal protective equipment and whatnot that they would need, and would agree around the safety first, obviously. We have a question that come in from Colin Beatty. Just to clarify, one person in a cohort gets sick, the whole cohort isolates and cohort is shut down for 14 days.
That's a good question. I don't necessarily have the health answer to that. I can take that one back and find out what happens. There's probably, I know there is some guidance document that's coming out. It's currently in the draft or the approval process, specifically around cohorts, that will provide some clarity. So obviously with, once these have been released, we find some areas that need some clarification. So health is working on that one. So that may be coming soon, but I will find out about that. Hopefully it doesn't happen, knock on wood, but we'll get some clarification around that one.
Perfect. Yeah, and then we can send an update out as well too on that. Another question that's come in, if a coach is in a cohort but coaches another group with social distancing, is that possible? And actually Kevin has dealt with this in our return to guide. So Kevin, do you want to speak to this, if a coach can have more than one cohort?
And so from the perspective of a coach coaching multiple groups, irrespective of the cohort, that's something that would be permitted. If the coach is directly involved in a cohort, they must maintain physical distancing, for anything else. And
So I think that's. Yeah, you kind of cut in and out a little bit there, Kevin, so I don't know if the answer was fully there. So what we outlined in the guidance in our requirement document is a coach can coach multiple cohorts so long as they can maintain physical distancing. An example of not physical distancing would be when, as a coach, you may be manipulating like an athlete's arm or working with them on stroke technique and having to work with an athlete that way. That would be not physical distancing, and so then you would need to be a part of that cohort. So it's probably dependent on your group, your coaching style, and sort of the parameters that you set up there. But you can have multiple cohorts that you coach so long as you always maintain the physical distancing. And another question that came in related to that is, do they need to PPE up if there are multiple cohorts? And no, they don't. You just need to maintain that physical distancing. So some great questions. Another question that come in, and I'm not sure who it's from, as swimmers are taking a class in summer school, is this considered a second cohort, and can the athlete participate in the swim cohort?
A class in summer school, no. So the cohorts are specific to sport, to performance. So if someone's in a band or something, and then the family cohorts. And so they're allowed to be in a family and a sport or performance cohort. There's no mention of school classrooms or anything at this time. So I would think you're okay to participate. I mean, again, Alberta Health understands that, we're interacting in grocery stores and what have you. So it's just about kind of reducing it as much, that our footprint as much as possible, but that would be allowed.
And another question that we had come in was with regards to our pool staff included in the club's cohort, especially lifeguards.
Yeah, I mean, Kevin can maybe jump in on the pool culture a little bit more than I, but ultimately we're hoping that the pool staff are staying as far away from us as possible. I'm not sure if there's situations where they need to be right there.
Yeah, I would say that they wouldn't be included in that cohort. Again, depending on the pool, but most of them would be able to physical distance, I believe. So if your pool situation is different, maybe reach out and we can work with you on that situation.
I guess the issue with that is that if they were part of a cohort, they'd have to be part of other cohorts in that pool, in that facility as well, and that would be an issue. So, I mean, I guess potentially a pool would be small enough that, yeah.
I can't
Ideally, they're
imagine
not part of it.
Yeah, I think they would be counted in the numbers because the other restriction with the pool is maximum of 100 people on the pool deck, right? And so they would be included in those numbers, I believe, but they would be separate from a swimming cohort. Another question from De Loyola. So just to understand, there are no age requirements for supervision anymore. So coaches 15 and over can supervise. So the 18 plus requirement was in Alberta Health Services documents. We at Swim Alberta have our own coach registration and requirement policy that all of our clubs are familiar with. And that would define for us a responsible individual. They removed the 18 and just referenced responsible. So again, as long as you are a registered coach and it's not a community coach, so a registered trained coach, you can be responsible on the pool deck for a group. The community coach actually needs to be with a swimming 101 or higher coach. Is that correct, Kevin? Do you want to speak to that a little more?
Yeah, the intent of community coach was to be an assistant coach with respect to the training. And so a trained and or certified swimming 101 coach that's 16 years of age or older, because they need to be 16 to take the 101. And so the 15-year-old should not be left alone to be coaching a group. It should be that 16 years of age or older.
Right. Good question though, because that did change. So good pick up on that. Any other questions that we have? Just a reminder again, 403-804-2708. We've had quite a few great questions today, and I'm liking the engagement here and the curiosity of questions that are coming in from our club. So it's been great. I guess as we're just waiting and as we slowly start to wrap up, the only thing I'd like to sort of emphasize as we sort of wind down a little here and the questions are slowing down is that, and we sort of spoke to it at the beginning as well too, is you'd have to remember that we are still in the pandemic. And although we are permitted to, from a sport perspective, look at how we set up cohorts, there still is a risk management perspective here for our clubs that you all need to consider. And so again, I just want to stress that, you know, we don't want to push the limits of what we've been allowed to do. We've been given an opportunity to train in a different way than what we imagined 2 weeks ago. We don't want to stretch the rules at this point, I think, because the outcome of that could be that we won't be able to be back swimming and sport will have its cohorts, right? So I just caution everybody that, again, we've been provided this opportunity through Alberta Health Services, and I think it's been a great stride forward for our clubs and particularly our athletes and getting them back in training and active again. But we do want to recognize that there are still rules in place and we shouldn't be looking at pushing the limits because the outcomes, I think, will go not to the advantage that we want as we go forward. And the other piece I would just stress is that in our role as head coaches and board members, we have an opportunity here to demonstrate leadership to our athletes and to the community at large in what we do. And I go back again to stressing those shared principles around physical distancing, hygiene. I mean, people can take the tests now, you no longer need to be symptomatic. So that's a great sort of example of leadership to be you know, testing ourselves and encouraging our athletes to be tested. Again, it's nothing that we can mandate, but I think it shows responsibility back to the efforts of the general community and Alberta Health Services and what we've been able to do here with the cohort swimming. A couple more questions have come in, and we'll quickly address these here. Can a swimmer that is playing a school sport, volleyball, basketball, still cohort with their swim group or lane group? I'm thinking that's 2 cohorts, but Stephen, thoughts on that?
Yeah, so we're asking athletes and participants to be cohorting with only one sport. Potentially, they could be doing some training with another sport or be involved in a sport like maybe cycling that you know, where you're able to physically distance, playing tennis, those types of things. But if they're cohorting within that other sport, they shouldn't be. Now, the question was specifically in reference to school sport, and again, that's September, and we have no idea what the landscape's going to look like at that time.
Right. Okay. Another question, I think this is sort of similar to cohorts, but we have situations where we have master's programs, so our 18 and older swimmers, and oftentimes they're in a shared club or they share coaching with the age group program. So the question is, can they share coaches with the age group club if the coach maintains social distancing with the master swimmers? Can they belong to an age group cohort as a coach and a master's cohort?
Yeah, so I think I understand. I mean, if the coach is involved in the other cohort, they would need to be physically distancing if the master swimmers are outside of that cohort. Potentially, if your numbers are low enough, you could include your master swimmers within the cohort of your age group swimmers. And I don't know, maybe I missed, is that?
Yeah, we typically don't do that, but I guess they could. I guess the essence of the question is that can they coach both? Can a coach both an age group program and a master's program and be seen as 2 separate cohorts? And I believe they can.
Yeah, I mean, it's just no different. If your coach is in the cohort, then they have to be physically distanced for all other coaching.
So that would be an example where our clubs need to work not only with their facilities, but with their partner clubs in that situation if coaches are shared. Question that we had come in yesterday, Stephen, and I don't know if you're able to answer this or take this away for us, but I know on the screening checklist, there's a requirement about out-of-country travel. And that if a family member has a federal exemption to travel out of country, can the athlete, the child, still participate even though they have a parent with a federal exemption?
Yeah, so that question was asked last week to Dr. Dina Hinshaw, and the answer was that yes. The only situation where that athlete would be excluded from participation would be if the traveler in their household is showing symptoms. So if they have an exemption to be outside of Canada and they're in and out, if they're not showing symptoms, then the family members can compete in their sport cohorts. So much like they're creating a cohort guidance document, I believe there's a new screening document that's coming. And I would think that because that and other issues, things like, you know, if shortness of breath or runny noses are results of allergies, then that isn't something that would exclude anybody. If muscle and joint aches are as a result of you know, sport involvement, then that isn't enough to exclude anybody. It would be kind of the unexplained thing for those symptoms. But yes, she did directly speak to that exemption piece, and it wouldn't exclude athletes.
Right. And then a follow-up to that related is, do they need to disclose this to the club? So, and they can still be part of a cohort, but do they need to disclose this? I didn't have this answer for her yesterday, so I didn't know if you did, but we can take it away. I'm not sure that needs to be disclosed, but
I don't think so. I mean, you know, it's an exception, and the language, like I say, might be changing on the screening checklist to make that a little bit more clear. You know, I mean, you can't make somebody disclose something. I don't expect you to ask all of your swimmers, if they've got someone who's traveling outside of Canada in their household and have a federal exemption. It's an oddly specific question, which probably doesn't apply to too many. So, I mean, they may tell you, and what I would do at that point is I'd note it on either the participant tracking or the screening document, you know, that this is the situation, but it isn't, again, it isn't enough to exclude an athlete from participation.
Thanks, Stephen. Another question that's come in, can Swim Alberta or clubs share an easier way to sign, collect, and store these extra forms needed for each activity session? So I can probably address that. The assumption of acknowledgement and assumption of risk forms need to be signed and sent in to Swim Alberta through the electronic means, as well as the declaration form. All the other forms that we've shared in the Return to Swimming requirement document, we've put on the website in both Word, fillable PDF, and PDF, specifically for the purpose that the clubs can take them and use them within their club setting. So if you have a system within your club setting to transfer those forms and make them work in a better and more efficient way for your club, by all means, feel free to do that. I would just make sure that as updates happen, you have the ability to update them as well too. But that's why those forms were put in PDF format and Word format on the website. So feel free to pull them down and use them within your club as you need to. A question from John Holt with the Mavericks. If a coach is a swimmer in a master's group, can they coach an age group cohort without social distancing?
Yeah, so I did mention that earlier. If the coach is in their own cohort, they would need to be physically distant for their coaching duties.
Okay.
Basically, it's one sport cohort per individual.
Right. And this question, I think we've already answered it as well too. So in a private club setting, can one sport cohort participate in multiple sports within our club? So Winter Club, Glenclow Club.
Yeah, great question. And I know I spoke to the Royal Glenara Club recently as well on that same thing. So if you have a sport cohort that you know can move around to multiple sports, that's fine. It's the number, not necessarily the activity. So much like swimming would have dryland training and other activities, you know, it's not necessarily what you're doing with that cohort. It's who's in that cohort. So yes. All
right, and that's my backlog of questions so far. So again, one more reminder, and then we'll wind down here. 403-804-2708. Again, if we don't get to your questions and you want to send them in afterwards by email, we can still compile them and get them out to you. We can work with Stephen too as we go forward. So if things come into us that we're not able to answer, I know we have the ability to reach out to both Stephen and Julie on your behalf to work through any questions as we launch into stage 2 here. So with that, I don't think there's anything else that we'll see coming in here as questions. So I just want to take a moment first to thank you, Stephen, for joining us on the call today. It was wonderful to have you on board with us, and your insights and answers to many of the questions as we launch into stage 2 have been invaluable for our club. So thank you for joining us and for your continued partnership with us as Swim Alberta. So thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity, and I wish everybody the best of luck in the next few months as they navigate this.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting times, isn't it? Yeah. So, and also thanks to Kevin, and just want to acknowledge the hard work that Kevin has done in the last couple of weeks in pulling together our requirements documents and getting it out into the hands of our clubs as quickly as we can. So again, we are recording this session, and we will make it available as soon as we can for those that weren't able to attend. Again, I just wish everybody well as we launch into a stage 2. A reminder again that pools will open at different rates across the province. I encourage all clubs to reach out and work with their facility operators. And again, I just encourage all clubs to really think through, similar to what Stephen talked to at the beginning, what your cohorts are going to look like, how you're going to structure that for the long run. And again, try not to push or sort of exceed the rules that we have in place right now to our benefit so that we can continue swimming well into the summer and the fall months ahead of us. So thank you, everybody. And hopefully we won't be back in another 2 weeks given round 3 of an update, but who knows, right? So all things go as not planned right now all the time. So thanks, everybody, and have a wonderful rest of your day.